I spent 12 years in the Marines. I've seen things most people can't imagine and survived moments that should have broken me. But nothing prepared me for the call I got at 2:17 a.m. that Sunday. The voice on the line was shaking. "We found your sister, Miss Monroe. She's alive, but barely." I don't remember hanging up or grabbing my keys, only the sound of my boots hitting the hospital floor as I ran to find her. Sophie had always been the gentle one, the kind of person who baked banana bread for new neighbors and cried during dog food commercials. Seeing her bruised, broken, hooked up to machines made something inside me go still. Not numb, not shocked, still, like the seconds before a storm explodes. She was conscious, barely. Her lips cracked when she tried to speak. I leaned closer, thinking maybe she wanted water. Maybe she was calling for our mom. But all she said was, "It was Eric." Eric, her husband, a decorated military officer. The man I had trusted enough to stand beside her at their wedding, clapping like a fool while he kissed my baby sister under a sky full of stars. My fists clenched before I realized it. The nurse asked if I needed a minute. I didn't. Marines don't freeze. We assess. We act. I nodded once and stared at Sophie's face, looking for the girl who used to chase fireflies in our backyard. All I could see was damage. I've seen enemy fire. I've heard the crack of sniper rounds. But the look in Sophie's eyes? That was different. It wasn't pain. It was terror. And it was fresh. I asked the doctors what happened. They said she was found in a ditch off Route 18, barely breathing, ribs broken, hands bruised like she'd been crawling. No ID, no phone, nothing but a wedding ring clutched so tightly it cut her palm. That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. Someone wanted her quiet. And Sophie, even in that state, made sure I'd know where to look. I sat beside her, took her hand, and whispered, "You're not alone. I'll handle this." Because that's what I do. I solve problems. I neutralize threats. But this time, the enemy wasn't in a foreign desert or hiding behind a wall. He was family, and I was going to war. I stayed by Sophie's side for hours, barely blinking. Her body was covered in bruises, but it wasn't just that. These weren't random injuries from a scuffle. Her wrists had thin ligature marks, symmetrical. Her ribs weren't just broken, they were crushed with precision. This wasn't a beating. It was controlled damage. It was calculated. The doctors whispered in the hallway when they thought I wasn't listening. One of them had served in the army as a medic. He muttered something like, "This is enhanced interrogation stuff." I didn't flinch, but inside, I felt something snap. Sophie barely spoke in those first few days. Her eyes stayed half-lidded, drifting in and out. But now and then, she would squeeze my hand or flick her gaze toward the window, like she was trying to tell me something but couldn't make the words come. Then one morning, the nurse lifted her pillow to adjust the sheets and found it a single yellow sticky note stuck underneath. 4 words, written in shaky ink. "Check the vault. R. R for Riley. Me." It was all she could manage. And it was enough. I waited until visiting hours ended and drove straight to Sophie's house, her place with Eric. It was quiet, too quiet. The front lawn was overtrimmed, the lights inside cold and staged, like no one had really lived there in months. I used the emergency key Sophie had hidden under the fake rock back in college. She never changed it. The house smelled like antiseptic and old lies. I walked through carefully, noting what was missing. No pictures of them together. No clutter. It felt hollow, but Sophie was smart. She wouldn't write that note if there wasn't something worth finding. I searched the master bedroom first, then the office. Nothing. Then I remembered Eric had always bragged about his war room, a locked space in the basement where he did classified work. Sophie used to joke that even she wasn't allowed in there. I found it behind the laundry area, a door with a keypad lock. I stared at it for a long time, then typed in Sophie's birthday, backward. The door clicked. Inside, the air was cool, almost sterile. It wasn't a war room. It was a vault. shelves of neatly stacked boxes, all labeled in military code, and in the corner, a metal filing cabinet with a false drawer. I pried it open with my combat knife. Inside was a single USB stick, tucked into a hollowed-out copy of Catch 2.2. Fitting. Back in my truck, I plugged it into a burner laptop. The files weren't photos or personal logs. They were spreadsheets, financial records, and encrypted memos. Large sums of money routed through military contractors, invoices for gear that was never delivered, and names, lots of names, including Eric's, including generals I'd only heard about in passing. This wasn't corruption, it was organized theft, hiding behind classified stamps and clearance levels. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the data. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. She hadn't been beaten out of rage. She'd been silenced. And somehow, she'd survived long enough to point me in the right direction. The message was clear. Stay quiet. But Sophie had done the opposite. She'd left a breadcrumb, trusting I would follow. And now I had. I wasn't looking at a domestic abuse case. I was staring at a cover-up. One that stretched far beyond one man or one marriage. And if I'd learned anything in the Marines, it was this. When someone tells you not to look, you look harder. I couldn't crack the USB files on my own. The encryption was military grade, and whoever designed it didn't want outsiders poking around. So I called Jason Trent. Jason and I served together in Kandahar. He ran comms and intel for our unit. Smart, cautious, always 3 steps ahead. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but when I mentioned Sophie and the kind of trouble I was in, he told me to come by, no questions asked. He lived just outside Quantico, in a cabin wired with more surveillance than some bases I'd been stationed on. As soon as I handed him the USB, he plugged it into a shielded laptop and began working in silence. 10 minutes in, he muttered, "This is bad." When Jason says that, it's never an exaggeration. The files were layered, with hidden folders buried under fake directories labeled as equipment maintenance logs. Inside, Jason found payment schedules, falsified procurement forms, and communications between high-ranking officials. The numbers didn't lie. Equipment that was never ordered. Supplies that were never delivered. Contracts signed and paid for through dummy corporations. It was theft, plain and simple. Then came the names. Eric was one of them. But he wasn't alone. 3 other officers were involved. Colonel Vance, Brigadier General Ellis, and Lieutenant Commander Ramirez. All of them held enough power to bury people like me for even asking questions. All of them had clearance to authorize the transactions. Jason sat back, arms crossed, eyes dark. "This isn't just fraud," he said. "This is a syndicate." I tried to stay calm, but my stomach was in knots. Sophie had stumbled into something massive, and they'd tried to silence her the only way they knew: violence. She wasn't supposed to survive. She definitely wasn't supposed to tell anyone. I asked Jason to pull whatever metadata he could, anything that might link the files to dates, times, or locations. He nodded and got back to work. Meanwhile, I started drafting a timeline, trying to map Sophie's movements with the transactions. Something about the timing felt deliberate, like she had known what she was looking at. Jason looked up suddenly. "There's a hidden subroutine on the drive. It's set to wipe everything, if connected to a government IP." My blood ran cold. That meant someone expected this to get leaked, and they were ready to cover their tracks. I wasn't just dealing with corrupt officers. I was dealing with men trained to erase evidence and people. I left Jason's place with a burner copy of the files and a head full of questions. Sophie had nearly died, trying to reveal this. And now I knew why. This wasn't just about one bad marriage. This was about betrayal at the highest levels. And I was only getting started. I woke up to the sound of my truck alarm blaring at 4:42 a.m. I ran outside barefoot, heart pounding, but there was no one around. The passenger door was cracked open, and the glove compartment had been rifled through. My burner laptop was gone. I stood there in the cold, trying to make sense of it. Only a handful of people knew I had that USB copy. Jason had encrypted it, hidden it behind multiple firewalls. But now, it was in someone else's hands. Someone who wanted it back badly enough to come onto private property in the middle of the night. I called Jason. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. I left 3 messages. Still nothing. He always responded, even if it was just a text. By noon, I drove to his cabin. The place was dark. The locks had been changed. There was a faint smell of bleach near the front door. And his surveillance feeds were all blank. I knocked. No answer. I broke in. The monitors were disconnected. Wires snipped clean. The laptop he used was gone. Only a single sticky note was taped to the fridge. Too close. Stay quiet. My blood ran cold. That afternoon, I got a call from the base. I was being summoned to speak with military investigators regarding an alleged breach of protocol. Something about me accessing secure files without authorization. When I showed up, they handed me a printed photo, grainy, low res, but it was me, walking toward Jason's place with a laptop in hand. They said they had footage of me tampering with restricted servers. I hadn't touched a government system in weeks. It didn't matter. The accusation was enough to trigger a formal inquiry. I wasn't being warned. I was being framed. On the way out, I noticed 2 men in civilian clothes sitting in a black SUV across the lot. They weren't looking at their phones. They were looking at me. They followed me with their eyes as I got into my car. I didn't go home. I drove in circles for an hour, checked my mirrors, and doubled back. No one followed. Not obviously, anyway. Back at Sophie's hospital room, I found her asleep. The nurses said someone had come by asking questions about me, said they were family. They weren't. That night, I slept in a motel, 2 towns over. Lights off, gun on the nightstand. My laptop was gone. Jason had disappeared. I had no evidence. And now, the people I was trying to expose had turned the scope on me. I wasn't hunting anymore. I was being hunted. And every move I made from here on out could be the one that got me silenced. Permanently. I didn't know where else to turn, so I called Carla Hughes. We weren't close, but her name kept coming up when I started digging into people who had questioned command before. She was a former sergeant, smart as hell, and got herself suspended 3 years ago for asking too many questions about budget inconsistencies. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had, what I'd lost, and what I needed. She paused, then said, "Meet me in 45. Same diner off I-66. Carla looked different from how I remembered. Leaner, harder. The kind of woman who had been burned and didn't care about hiding the scars anymore. She slid into the booth, like she'd never left the game. I heard about your sister," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." I nodded, unsure how to respond. She got straight to it. I looked into Eric 2 years ago, found inconsistencies in logistics reports, got told to back off. She opened a small tablet and showed me a trail of flagged transfers. Everything was routed through military vendor contracts, small amounts at a time, buried in larger budgets. Most of it was sent to holding companies that didn't exist on paper, but one of them led to a bank in Zurich. The account holder? Eleanor Cross, Eric's mother, deceased since 2018. I leaned in. "So he's been laundering through a dead woman's name?" Carla nodded. "And it's not just him. I found 3 other accounts, all tied to retired relatives of active duty officers. It all lined up with what Jason and I had found. Except now, I had someone else who'd seen it. Someone was still breathing. Carla had been building her own file quietly, waiting for a crack to appear in the armor. Sophie's case had opened it. We decided to combine what we had. Carla handed me a flash drive and said she had backup copies stored overseas. Just in case. It felt like the first moment I wasn't completely alone in this mess. Like the shadows had more than just enemies. Carla warned me, "You're too visible now. They'll come for you faster than they came for me." I didn't doubt it, but we had something they didn't. Proof. And now, we had each other. We didn't make a plan that night. We made a pact. We were going to hit back, not just to protect ourselves, but to make this thing bleed where it mattered. The web they'd spun was vast, but we finally had a loose thread. And I was ready to pull. We had one shot. Carla and I knew Eric was too careful to leave anything in writing, but his ego was a different story. If we could get him talking, really talking, we could burn him down from the inside out. So we set a trap. I reached out through a mutual contact and told Eric I wanted to make a deal. Said I was done fighting. Said I had backups of the files and wanted it out clean. It was bait. And he took it faster than I expected. We met in a private lounge at a country club he frequented. I wore a blazer, just formal enough to look serious. Taped under the lining was a recorder, patched through to Carla, who was in a van across the street with 2 FBI agents. They were listening in, fingers hovering over keyboards. Eric walked in smiling, cool as ever. "Glad you came to your senses," he said. I nodded and slid a manila folder across the table. It was empty. Just enough weight to feel real. "I want immunity," I said, keeping my voice flat, "in exchange for silence." "And?" he chuckled. "You think this is the first time someone's tried to get clever?" He leaned in. "The system protects people like me. Always has, always will." He kept talking. About the contracts, about the generals who owed him favors, about how Sophie was too curious for her own good. I kept nodding, keeping my hands steady. Every word was a nail in his own coffin. Then came the line we needed. "You want to survive this, Riley? You bury everything, like I buried that reporter in 21. Like we buried Sophie." The moment hung in the air, heavy and final. I didn't blink. Outside, Carla gave the signal. Within seconds, the doors burst open. FBI agents stormed in, badges up, guns drawn. Eric barely had time to curse before he was cuffed and pulled to his feet. He looked at me with pure hatred, but I didn't flinch. I stood there while they read him his rights. Every second felt like justice, scraping its way back to the surface. In the van, Carla handed me a headset. I could hear the agents confirming the recording had captured everything. Chain of custody logged, statement admissible. We had him. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the weight start to lift. Not gone, but shifting. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. The lies were crumbling. The silence was broken. And Eric Cross was finally out of places to hide. Eric was convicted on 5 federal counts, including conspiracy, embezzlement, and attempted murder. He tried to cut a deal halfway through the trial, but it was too late. The evidence spoke louder than he ever could. Sophie stayed in recovery for months, but she pulled through. The doctors said it was a miracle. I think it was something else, her stubborn, quiet strength. The kind that doesn't scream but survives, even when the world tries to crush it. She lives in Oregon now. Near the water, paints, hikes, and volunteers at a women's shelter. Sometimes I visit, and we don't talk about what happened. We just sit in the sun, drink coffee, and let the silence mean peace instead of pain. As for me, the charges were dropped. The inquiry closed. My name cleared. But none of that erased the weight of what I saw, what I had to do. Justice doesn't give you back time. It just stops the bleeding. People always ask me if I did it for revenge, if I felt satisfied watching Eric let out in chains. The truth? I didn't care how it ended for him. I only cared that it stopped. That it couldn't happen to someone else's sister, someone else's friend. Justice, real justice, isn't revenge. It's the truth that refuses to stay buried. It's fighting through fear and silence and power until the facts are too loud to ignore. And sometimes, that truth comes from the most broken places. I still wake up some nights, heart racing, thinking I'm back in that hospital room. But then I remember Sophie's voice, shaky but defiant. It was Eric. 4 words that lit a fuse. 4 words that changed everything. We always talk about protecting what we love. But what are we willing to risk to defend it? What will we sacrifice to make sure someone else doesn't have to suffer the same silence? I'm not a hero. I'm not a martyr. I'm just someone who chose not to look away. And maybe that's what makes the difference. So, I'll leave you with this. When the truth finds you ugly, dangerous, inconvenient, will you bury it? Or will you bring it into the light, no matter the cost?